No one at the gate knew the man standing there had once been the kind of operator entire briefings were classified just to mention. The morning sun hung over the secured military installation in Fort Henderson, casting sharp reflections across the steel barriers and polished glass of the main control post as vehicles passed in steady rhythm and personnel moved with practiced discipline. Yet everything shifted the moment an elderly man stepped into the approach lane without urgency or hesitation. His name was William Carter, white male, 72 years old, wearing a plain dark jacket, worn boots, and a posture that did not match the assumptions forming instantly around him. Two security officers near the entry point exchanged a quick glance, not because he posed any threat, but because he did not fit the expected pattern of presence at a facility of this scale. Commander James Holloway observed from the elevated glass control room above the gate sector, his attention briefly drawn away from routine reports as he noticed the subtle disruption forming below. William Carter did not announce himself, did not waive identification, and did not seek acknowledgment. Instead, he simply stood at the checkpoint as if waiting for time itself to decide whether to recognize him. Officer Daniel Reed approached first, maintaining professional distance while scanning the man's basic credentials, his expression neutral but slightly skeptical as he asked the standard verification questions, receiving calm, minimal responses that offered no immediate clarity. Around them, movement slowed just enough for the atmosphere to feel heavier, not tense, but uncertain in a way that did not yet have definition. Lieutenant Mark Collins glanced toward the control tower, expecting instruction, but none came. Commander James Holloway remained silent, his eyes fixed on William Carter with a focus that did not yet have explanation behind it, only a faint sense of familiarity buried beneath years of operational memory. The elderly man's posture remained unchanged, shoulders relaxed, gaze forward, hands steady at his sides, showing no reaction to the subtle shift in attention around him. A slight wind moved through the gate structure, causing flags to shift and metallic fixtures to hum softly, adding a mechanical rhythm to the moment that contrasted with the stillness forming at its center. Officer Reed attempted another verification step, referencing internal clearance logs, but the system returned no immediate recognition, increasing the quiet confusion among the personnel present. Still, William Carter did not react, as if waiting for something deeper than digital confirmation. From above, Commander James Holloway leaned slightly forward, narrowing his focus as he studied the man's stance, the controlled stillness, and the subtle discipline in his breathing pattern that did not match civilian behavior. Something in his memory attempted to align the present image with fragmented past operational records, but the connection remained incomplete. Below, the gate area continued functioning, yet it felt as though two different layers of time were overlapping in the same physical space. Officer Collins finally stepped closer, lowering his voice as he repeated the verification request, while maintaining respectful distance, and still William Carter responded without urgency, providing only essential information that did not resolve the uncertainty. The silence that followed was not empty but weighted, as if the environment itself was waiting for recognition to complete a hidden equation. Commander James Holloway finally made a small gesture, signaling for restraint rather than escalation, and in that subtle motion the tone of the entire gate shifted from routine procedure to focused observation. William Carter remained calm, his expression unchanged, standing in place as though the situation did not require interpretation, only continuation. And in that moment, without announcement or confirmation, the foundation of what everyone believed they understood about the man at the gate began to quietly destabilize. The atmosphere at the gate did not return to normal after the initial verification attempts. Instead, it settled into a more careful version of uncertainty, as if every person present had unconsciously agreed that the situation required closer attention rather than resolution. William Carter remained at the checkpoint without shifting his position, his presence steady and unchanged, while Officer Daniel Reed continued to examine the basic records available through the system with growing awareness that standard procedures were no longer producing clarity. Above them, Commander James Holloway maintained his position in the control area, but his focus had narrowed further, no longer scanning the entire gate operation, instead locking onto specific details of the elderly man's posture and the subtle symmetry in his stillness. A slight movement occurred when William Carter adjusted the strap of a worn bag resting near his side, and that small action revealed a metallic object partially concealed beneath the fabric, catching ambient light for less than a second before returning to shadow. The reflection was brief, but it interrupted the controlled rhythm of observation among the personnel, particularly Officer Mark Collins, who noticed the detail and hesitated before speaking. He did not announce it immediately. Instead, he confirmed it visually a second time, as if unsure whether what he saw had actual significance. The object was not displayed openly, yet its presence altered the tone at the gate in a measurable way, shifting attention from procedural verification toward cautious recognition. Commander James Holloway, observing from above, also registered the change, his gaze tightening slightly as he tried to align the visual fragment with stored operational memory. It was not a clear identification, but rather a pattern disruption, something familiar but incomplete, like a file that had been referenced in the past but never fully accessed. Below, William Carter remained unchanged in demeanor, showing no reaction to the attention the object had unintentionally drawn, as though it was not meant to provoke recognition but simply existed as part of his history without need for explanation. Officer Reed attempted to continue standard protocol by requesting additional confirmation documents, but his voice carried less certainty than before, and even he seemed aware that the interaction had moved beyond routine verification. A quiet adjustment occurred among the surrounding security personnel, not a physical movement, but a psychological one, where posture remained professional, yet awareness expanded beyond initial assumptions. Lieutenant Collins took a half step back, creating more space, not out of fear, but out of instinctive recalibration of perception. The control room above grew quieter, with fewer spoken instructions, as Commander James Holloway raised a hand slightly toward the display console, pausing incoming procedural updates without formally interrupting operations. His attention remained fixed on William Carter, and now the focus included not just the man but the history implied by what had just been partially observed. A faint memory surfaced within him, connected to training reports and classified briefings from years earlier, but it lacked confirmation and remained fragmented, resisting immediate identification. The gate environment continued to function, vehicles passing at a controlled pace, personnel maintaining duty positions, yet all of it now felt secondary to the stillness centered around the elderly man. William Carter's expression did not change, but his presence seemed to hold a different kind of weight, not increasing in intensity, but revealing depth through contrast with the rising attention around him. Officer Reed finally paused his verification attempts, lowering his handheld device slightly, signaling a temporary suspension of procedural escalation without verbal announcement. The silence that followed was not imposed but shared, as if every individual present had reached the same internal conclusion that standard systems were no longer sufficient to define what they were observing. Commander James Holloway remained in place, his focus unwavering, as the faint trace of recognition continued to form beneath layers of institutional memory, slowly approaching clarity but not yet arriving. And in that suspended moment, the presence of William Carter at the gate transitioned from unexplained anomaly into something that demanded a different kind of understanding, one not yet spoken aloud but already beginning to reshape the entire structure of perception around him. The moment following the suspension of routine verification did not bring resolution, but instead introduced a deeper phase of observation, where every detail at the gate was now being interpreted with heightened sensitivity and cautious reassessment. William Carter remained in the same position at the checkpoint, his posture unchanged, his expression calm and controlled, while the surrounding personnel no longer treated him as a routine visitor but as an unresolved variable within a system that demanded clarity. Officer Daniel Reed stood slightly back from his terminal, no longer actively inputting queries, as if waiting for instruction that had not yet been formally issued. Above, Commander James Holloway maintained his focus on the elderly man, but now his attention had shifted from physical observation to internal analysis, comparing fragmented memory references against archived operational awareness that surfaced in incomplete pieces rather than full confirmation. A subtle change occurred when Lieutenant Mark Collins initiated a secondary verification path through restricted internal logs, bypassing standard clearance summaries and accessing deeper historical records tied to legacy operations. The interface displayed partial redactions, classification markers, and fragmented identifiers that did not immediately form a complete narrative. Yet one element stood out clearly enough to alter the tone of the control room. A designation linked to a former specialized operations unit appeared in a limited access field, not fully displayed, but partially visible through authorization layering, suggesting a past assignment profile that carried significant historical weight. The presence of that fragment caused a noticeable shift in Commander James Holloway's expression, not dramatic, but precise, as if a mental connection had finally aligned with a long-dormant reference point. He did not speak immediately, instead maintaining silence while continuing to examine the record feed, confirming that what he was seeing was not an error or duplication, but a legitimate archival entry tied to classified operational history. Below, Officer Reed noticed the change in command posture and paused entirely, no longer attempting procedural clarification, as it became clear that the situation had moved beyond standard administrative resolution. William Carter remained still, not reacting to the activity surrounding his identity verification, as though the system of confirmation held no relevance to his presence in that moment. The wind across the gate structure shifted again, lightly moving flags and casting shifting reflections across metal surfaces, reinforcing the sense that time itself was slowing around the central focus of attention. Lieutenant Collins stepped closer to the console display, narrowing his eyes as he reviewed the partial data, attempting to interpret the incomplete classification markers, which referenced training environments, high-level operational readiness, and specialized unit association without fully disclosing the full record. Commander James Holloway finally spoke, but his voice carried a different tone than earlier, no longer procedural, but carefully measured, as if each word required confirmation before release. He instructed a deeper authentication request, not to challenge William Carter, but to ensure that what had surfaced in the system was correctly interpreted. The response from the system introduced additional layers of restricted history, each revealing small but significant fragments of past operational involvement that collectively suggested a level of service far beyond conventional assignment history. The control room grew quieter as each new fragment appeared, not due to instruction, but due to collective recognition that they were approaching a truth that had been obscured for a long time. Below, Officer Reed finally looked directly at William Carter again, but this time without skepticism, his expression replaced by careful reassessment shaped by incomplete but increasingly compelling evidence. William Carter's presence remained unchanged, but the perception of that presence had shifted significantly among all observers, transforming from uncertainty into controlled anticipation. Commander James Holloway continued to study the data stream, his focus narrowing further as memory and record began to converge, suggesting a connection to elite operational classification that required formal acknowledgment beyond standard protocol. Yet, even with partial recognition forming, no verbal confirmation was issued, as if the system itself was still assembling the final piece needed to complete the identity alignment. In that suspended state, the gate was no longer simply a point of entry, but a threshold between recorded history and present understanding, and William Carter stood precisely at its center, unchanged in form, but increasingly redefined by the information slowly revealing what had been hidden beneath years of silence. The emergence of deeper classification data did not resolve the uncertainty at the gate, but instead transformed it into a structured form of recognition that required careful interpretation by those observing from both the control room and the ground level. William Carter remained positioned at the checkpoint without any visible reaction to the ongoing escalation of internal verification processes, his calm presence unchanged despite the increasing intensity of attention directed toward his historical records. In the control room above, Commander James Holloway continued to analyze the partial operational files now displayed across multiple secured interfaces, each layer revealing additional fragments of classification history that no longer fit within standard personnel categories. The designation previously observed was now supported by supplemental references, including training codes, deployment summaries, and mission structure indicators that suggested association with highly specialized operational units that functioned under restricted command authority. Although the records remained partially redacted, the accumulation of consistent fragments removed any remaining assumption that the system was misidentifying the subject. Officer Daniel Reed, now fully disengaged from routine protocol execution, stood in silence as he observed the command-level reaction, recognizing that his role had shifted from verification to witness. Below, Lieutenant Mark Collins continued refining the access parameters, carefully navigating restricted archival pathways that required elevated clearance validation, each step revealing additional metadata that reinforced the historical significance of the individual standing at the gate. The environment around William Carter felt increasingly still, not because activity had stopped, but because perception had narrowed entirely toward him as the central reference point of unresolved identity confirmation. Commander James Holloway finally requested a consolidated historical summary, initiating a full system compilation of all accessible records related to the fragmented designation now under review. The system response did not present a single unified file, but rather a layered reconstruction of operational history, compiled from multiple archived entries that referenced specialized training environments, covert operational readiness evaluations, and long-term strategic deployment frameworks. As the compiled data expanded, a clearer structural pattern emerged, indicating sustained involvement in high-level operational scenarios that required exceptional discipline and advanced field capability, though specific mission details remained permanently restricted under classification protocols. The weight of this information altered the atmosphere in the control room in a measurable way, not through sound or motion, but through collective silence that replaced procedural communication. Commander James Holloway's expression shifted subtly as he reviewed the convergence of data points, his focus narrowing to a level of precision that indicated full cognitive alignment with the emerging conclusion. Yet despite the clarity forming within the data, no verbal declaration was issued, as if institutional protocol itself required a final threshold of confirmation that had not yet been formally crossed. On the ground level, Officer Reed observed William Carter again, but now his gaze carried acknowledgment rather than skepticism, reflecting the irreversible shift in interpretation that had taken place. William Carter remained unchanged, neither acknowledging the data nor reacting to the recognition forming above him, as though his presence existed independently of institutional validation. The gate environment continued its controlled operations in the background, but all peripheral activity now felt secondary to the concentrated focus on the central figure whose history was being reconstructed in real time. Lieutenant Collins completed the final access sequence available to his authorization level and stepped back slightly, signaling that no further procedural escalation was possible without direct command override. The control room fell into a state of sustained silence as Commander James Holloway studied the final compiled structure of fragmented records, now forming a coherent but incomplete portrait of a past operational identity that carried significant historical weight within classified military archives. In that moment, the gap between unknown presence and recognized legacy narrowed further, not through announcement or confirmation, but through the quiet convergence of evidence that required no immediate explanation to alter the perception of everyone present. The compiled operational reconstruction displayed across the secured systems did not bring final resolution, but instead introduced a deeper and more structured form of recognition that now influenced every level of observation within the facility. William Carter remained at the gate checkpoint in the same position as before, his presence steady and unchanged, yet no longer interpreted as an unknown variable, but rather as an incomplete historical identity waiting for formal acknowledgment. In the control room above, Commander James Holloway maintained full focus on the consolidated data stream, which now presented a layered operational profile constructed from multiple classified archives, each contributing fragments of a long-term service history that extended across specialized military domains. The system had moved beyond identification ambiguity and into historical alignment, where fragmented entries were now consistently referencing elite operational frameworks associated with high-level strategic deployment and advanced field coordination environments. Despite the clarity forming within the data, the emotional response within the control room remained controlled and disciplined, expressed not through speech but through sustained silence and reduced procedural activity. Officer Daniel Reed stood motionless near the secondary console, no longer attempting verification or correction, as it had become evident that the subject of their review existed outside standard administrative categorization. Below, Lieutenant Mark Collins carefully monitored the final integrity checks of the archival reconstruction, ensuring that no contradictory records remained unaccounted for within the system's cross-referenced layers. As each validation cycle completed, the consistency of the historical pattern strengthened, reducing uncertainty to near zero while increasing the weight of significance attached to the identity being confirmed. Commander James Holloway finally initiated a restricted historical playback sequence, allowing the system to reconstruct a partial operational environment based on archived mission logs and training evaluations associated with the subject's designation. The display did not present direct visual footage, but rather a structured analytical reconstruction of field conditions, communication patterns, and tactical coordination frameworks that reflected highly specialized operational readiness scenarios. Within this reconstruction, patterns of disciplined decision-making and adaptive field response emerged, reinforcing the interpretation of a career defined by precision under controlled pressure environments. As the reconstructed data continued to unfold, subtle recognition indicators began to align across multiple archived systems, confirming that the designation linked to William Carter had been consistently referenced across different operational eras without full public disclosure. The control room lighting appeared slightly colder as attention remained fixed on the evolving reconstruction, emphasizing the psychological weight of accumulated historical evidence. Commander James Holloway maintained his position without movement, his focus narrowing further as the final segments of the archival reconstruction completed their alignment into a coherent operational narrative. Although no explicit announcement was made, the system had effectively transitioned from identification process to historical confirmation, where the subject was no longer being evaluated, but recognized through structured institutional memory. On the ground level, William Carter remained completely still, unaffected by the analytical reconstruction unfolding above, as if the validation of his past held no relevance to his present position. The surrounding personnel at the gate maintained disciplined silence, their earlier uncertainty replaced by a controlled awareness shaped by the accumulation of verified historical data. The entire environment, both above and below, had now shifted into a state where interpretation was no longer speculative, but grounded in confirmed operational history, even if that history remained partially classified and inaccessible in detail. In this sustained moment of recognition, the gap between unknown presence and established legacy had effectively closed, leaving only the formal requirement of acknowledgment yet to be spoken aloud. The transition from analytical confirmation to institutional awareness did not occur through a single declaration, but through a gradual collapse of uncertainty across multiple layers of command interpretation, where each new validation cycle reinforced the same conclusion without contradiction. William Carter remained at the gate in the same position, his presence unchanged, yet now observed under a completely different lens, where identity was no longer being questioned but internally categorized as verified historical significance awaiting formal acknowledgment. In the control room, Commander James Holloway stood motionless as the final composite reconstruction stabilized across the secured display systems, presenting a consolidated operational profile that aligned consistently with multiple classified archival references. The data no longer appeared fragmented or speculative. Instead, it formed a continuous historical narrative supported by training records, deployment structures, and long-range operational evaluations that collectively confirmed elite-level service history. Within restricted command frameworks, despite this clarity, the atmosphere within the room did not shift toward verbal acknowledgement, but instead deepened into silence, as if institutional protocol itself required a final moment of internal alignment before any outward expression could be permitted. Officer Daniel Reed remained still beside the secondary console, no longer interacting with the system, his role reduced to observation as the implications of the reconstructed identity fully settled into the operational environment. Below, Lieutenant Mark Collins completed the final redundancy sweep across archival layers, ensuring that no alternative interpretations remained viable within the accessible data structure, effectively closing all procedural pathways for doubt. Commander James Holloway then accessed the final restricted summary layer, which condensed the entire historical reconstruction into a unified operational designation profile, confirming sustained association with highly specialized mission categories that had remained classified for extended periods of institutional history. As this final layer resolved, the control room lighting appeared unchanged, yet the psychological atmosphere shifted into a state of controlled recognition, where authority was no longer actively processing information, but instead absorbing the implications of what had already been confirmed. The commander's expression tightened slightly, not in confusion, but in measured realization, as the structured weight of historical service record aligned fully with the individual standing below at the gate. No verbal instruction was issued, and no procedural escalation was initiated because the system itself had already reached its interpretive limit. On the ground level, William Carter remained completely composed, his posture steady, his gaze forward, unaffected by the transformation occurring above him, as if his identity had always existed independent of institutional validation. Around him, the personnel at the gate maintained disciplined silence, their earlier uncertainty now replaced by a controlled awareness shaped by accumulated confirmation rather than speculation. Officer Reed lowered his gaze slightly, not in avoidance, but in acknowledgment, reflecting the irreversible shift from procedural evaluation to historical recognition that had now taken place. The environment itself seemed to stabilize into a different operational rhythm, where movement continued but perception had fundamentally changed, and every observer now interpreted the presence at the gate through the lens of verified legacy rather than unknown identity. In the control room, Commander James Holloway finally stepped closer to the central display, not to continue analysis, but to confirm internally what the system had already concluded, as the final compiled designation remained fixed and unambiguous within classified parameters. Yet, even with full internal recognition established, no formal declaration was made, as if the institution itself required a final threshold of acknowledgment that extended beyond data and into action. The silence that followed was not emptiness, but structured certainty, where every participant understood that the moment of recognition had already occurred, even if it had not yet been spoken aloud. The moment of full institutional recognition did not arrive through announcement or ceremony, but through a final convergence of command-level understanding, where every fragmented layer of verification, classification, and historical reconstruction aligned into a single irreversible interpretation. William Carter remained at the gate in complete stillness, his presence unchanged, yet now perceived through a fully stabilized operational lens that no longer treated him as an unknown subject, but as a confirmed historical identity embedded within classified military memory. In the control room, Commander James Holloway stood before the central display without speaking, his posture rigid but controlled, as the final consolidated designation profile remained fixed on the system interface, confirming elite operational history across multiple restricted service categories. The data no longer shifted or required further validation, as every archival pathway had already converged into a singular confirmed record structure that left no procedural ambiguity. Officer Daniel Reed remained silent at the secondary station, no longer interacting with any system input, as his role had fully transitioned from verification support to witness of confirmed institutional truth. Below, Lieutenant Mark Collins completed a final confirmation sweep of redundancy filters, ensuring that no alternative interpretations or residual anomalies existed within the classified database, effectively sealing the identity confirmation process at all accessible levels. The control room atmosphere remained unchanged physically, yet psychologically it had settled into a state of complete recognition, where authority no longer needed to interpret, but only to acknowledge what had already been established through structured evidence. Commander James Holloway finally lowered his gaze slightly, not in uncertainty, but in controlled acknowledgement of the weight carried by the confirmed operational history now associated with the individual at the gate. Despite this internal resolution, no formal verbal declaration was issued, as institutional protocol still required a separate procedural threshold for outward recognition that extended beyond analytical confirmation. On the ground level, William Carter remained steady and composed, his expression unchanged, as if the entire process unfolding above him had no influence on his present state of being. Around him, the personnel at the gate maintained disciplined silence, their earlier uncertainty now fully replaced by structured awareness shaped by verified historical confirmation rather than assumption or speculation. Officer Daniel Reed finally stepped back from his position slightly, creating distance not out of avoidance, but as a natural response to the shift from procedural evaluation to completed recognition. The environment across the gate area continued normal operational flow, yet every observer now interpreted movement, presence, and silence through a fundamentally altered perspective shaped by confirmed legacy status. In the control room, Commander James Holloway reviewed the final display once more, ensuring internal alignment with institutional protocol, but the result remained unchanged, as the system had already reached full resolution without contradiction or ambiguity. The recognition that had been forming across multiple verification layers had now fully stabilized into a single coherent truth, leaving no further analytical pathways to pursue. Even so, the absence of verbal acknowledgment created a suspended moment where understanding existed entirely within institutional awareness, but had not yet transitioned into spoken confirmation. William Carter remained at the center of this unresolved silence, not as an unknown presence, but as a fully recognized figure whose historical significance had already been established, even if not yet formally declared. The gate, the control room, and every observer within the system now shared the same conclusion, held quietly in disciplined restraint, marking the completion of recognition without the need for external expression. The final moment of institutional acknowledgement did not arrive as a formal declaration, but as a synchronized collapse of remaining procedural restraint across all levels of observation, where recognition that had been forming internally within the command structure finally stabilized into a complete and irreversible understanding. William Carter remained at the gate in absolute stillness, his posture unchanged, his expression calm and controlled, while the environment around him had already shifted into a state where his identity was no longer in question but fully established within institutional memory. In the control room, Commander James Holloway stood directly in front of the central display, his focus locked on the final consolidated operational profile that confirmed the complete historical designation without contradiction or ambiguity. The system had reached its endpoint, where all archival references, classification layers, and operational records converged into a single verified identity structure that required no further analysis. Officer Daniel Reed remained silent beside the secondary console, no longer engaging with any procedural input, as the weight of confirmed recognition settled into complete institutional awareness. Below, Lieutenant Mark Collins maintained position at the terminal, ensuring that all verification loops remained closed, with no residual uncertainty or unprocessed archival fragments remaining within the system. The control room atmosphere was no longer shifting or evolving, but instead had entered a state of final confirmation, where understanding was complete and only acknowledgement remained unspoken. Commander James Holloway's expression tightened slightly as he reviewed the final structured profile one last time, confirming internally what the system had already resolved beyond doubt, that the individual at the gate carried a fully validated legacy of elite operational service embedded within restricted military history. At that precise moment, the command hierarchy within the room transitioned from analysis to recognition, and from recognition to action, as protocol shifted from evaluation to formal acknowledgement. A single movement broke the stillness as Commander James Holloway stepped away from the central display and began descending from the control level toward the gate, his pace measured and deliberate, reflecting the significance of the moment rather than urgency. As he moved, the personnel within the control room did not speak or interfere, maintaining disciplined silence as institutional procedure gave way to ceremonial recognition. On the ground level, William Carter remained in place, his presence unchanged, as he observed no reaction to the movement occurring above and around him, as if the shift in command structure had already been anticipated long before it became visible. The surrounding gate personnel subtly adjusted their posture as awareness spread through them in quiet confirmation, each individual recognizing that the moment of verification had fully transitioned into acknowledgment. When Commander James Holloway arrived at the gate level, he stopped several feet in front of William Carter, maintaining formal posture while the surrounding environment settled into complete silence. There was no announcement, no procedural statement, and no verbal explanation issued, as the recognition required no further articulation within the established military context. Instead, Commander James Holloway raised his hand in a precise and formal salute, holding it steady with controlled discipline, acknowledging the confirmed historical service and legacy of the individual before him. The surrounding personnel followed the gesture in disciplined sequence, not through command, but through shared understanding of what had already been established. William Carter remained still for a brief moment, his expression unchanged, before offering a restrained acknowledgment that carried the weight of long-standing service without the need for words. The gate environment, the control room above, and every observer within the structure now shared the same unified understanding, where identity, legacy, and recognition had fully aligned, completing a process that required no further confirmation and leaving only silent respect in its place. The final transition from recognition to closure did not require further confirmation, because every layer of institutional analysis had already converged into a single unified understanding that left no remaining ambiguity within the operational framework. Role had fully transitioned into observation of a completed historical acknowledgment event. Below, Lieutenant Mark Collins completed a final system integrity check across all archived records, confirming that no residual uncertainty or conflicting classification entries remained within the database, effectively sealing the confirmation process at every operational level. The control structure above the gate remained active, but no longer processed uncertainty, as all data streams had stabilized into a single coherent historical designation that required no further interpretation. William Carter did not move or speak, his presence steady and composed, as if the recognition surrounding him had always been expected rather than newly discovered. The silence across the facility was no longer tension-driven, but resolution-driven, carrying the weight of completion rather than anticipation. Commander James Holloway finally stepped back half a pace, maintaining formal stance, and allowed the moment to exist without interruption, acknowledging through presence rather than speech that the process of recognition had fully concluded. Around him, the personnel maintained disciplined posture, reflecting the same understanding that had already been established across all command levels, where no further action was necessary because the outcome had already been resolved. The gate, once a point of verification and uncertainty, now functioned only as a boundary between past classification and present acknowledgment, where historical identity had been fully restored into institutional awareness. William Carter remained at its center for a final moment, not as an unknown figure, but as a fully recognized legacy within the system that had once questioned him. Then, without ceremony or announcement, he turned and began to walk forward beyond the gate structure, his movement calm and unhurried, carrying no urgency and no hesitation, as if the weight of confirmation had already been left behind in the silence he had just passed through. Commander James Holloway watched him depart without speaking, maintaining a formal salute until William Carter was no longer within immediate proximity, and only then lowering his hand with controlled restraint. The surrounding personnel remained still until the movement had fully completed, preserving the final moment of acknowledgement within disciplined silence. In that final transition, the system, the command structure, and every observer present shared the same irreversible understanding that recognition had not created significance, but simply revealed what had always existed, leaving behind a quiet and lasting respect that required no further explanation.